Welcome everyone. CivilNet is in Tsaghkadzor covering an international symposium on Russian studies organized by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And I'm here joined by Hanna Notte, one of the participants, senior associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Hanna, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I want to understand the evolution of the Russian power and the events that preceded the ascending of Vladimir Putin's coming to power. So there was the 1998 financial crisis in Russia, and the West, International Monetary Fund, failed to provide bailout. And there are many people who argue that if the West provided the necessary financial assistance to Russia, liberals would have replaced Boris Yeltsin rather than security people in the face of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the Russian financial crisis, which came towards the end of what were very tumultuous 1990s in Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union, was certainly an incisive event. But there was something else going on when Vladimir Putin ascended to power, and that was the Second Chechen War, Russia fighting another war in Chechnya. So certainly with the combination of the financial crisis and the war in Chechnya, Russians were looking towards stability, and Vladimir Putin promised to deliver that when he ascended to power. What's interesting about this early phase of Putin in power is that I think he was still intent on somewhat constructive relations with the United States. After 9/11 in 2001 and with George W. Bush in power in the United States, Putin was one of the first to call the American president. Russia consented to the Americans using bases in Central Asia for their mission in Afghanistan. Russia's reaction to the United States abrogating the ABM treaty was relatively moderate, as was Russia's response to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, even though the Russian Federation was against this war. It's really from 2004, 2005 onwards that you see Russia's grievance with the United States, with the West coming more to the fore, with the Orange Revolution and the Rose Revolution in Ukraine and in Georgia, respectively. And the first real indicator that the West gets in terms of Russia's grievance, Vladimir Putin's grievance with the West, is the famous Munich Security Conference speech in 2007. So you have, I think, two things happening simultaneously. Russia's own economic resurgence on the back of rising oil prices, and we have Russia's military reforms after the short war against Georgia in 2008, but also this growing disillusionment with Western policy. We do have a short-lived attempt still to put Russia-West relations on a more constructive footing with the so-called reset in US-Russia relations under Presidents Medvedev and Obama in 2009. Some things get done in that time period with the New START Treaty, with some cooperation on Iran. But I really see sort of from the early 2010s, Vladimir Putin's return to the presidency, but also growing disagreements between Russia and the United States in the Middle East, with Syria, with Libya. I think from then, we're really on a downward trajectory in Russia-US relations, Russia really kicking more above its weight. And then, of course, we get to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and sort of a growing arsenal of issues in the Russia-US relationship up sort of to the present day, or this inflection point with the invasion of Ukraine last year. That would be my short sort of take on the evolution of Russian foreign policy, but also the Russia-West relationship over the last 2 decades.
What was the main rationale behind Russian foreign policies after 2012, when Putin's second presidency started? What has changed in general, apart from the Rose Revolution and other developments in so-called Russia's near abroad?
I think an important factor here is Russia's perception of the Arab Spring, which is unfolding in the Middle East with events in Libya and the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. Russia had abstained on the UN Security Council in 2011 under President Medvedev, and I think this was a big grievance for Russia subsequently. At the same time, you have the civil war in Syria breaking out, and Russia's argument is that the West is fomenting regime change in the Middle East, and the narrative goes that it's fomenting regime change and color revolution in the Middle East, but ultimately this is also a strategy that the United States wants to use for Russia's own neighborhood and ultimately vis-a-vis Russia itself. So Russia becomes much more muscular in wanting to thwart Western policy in the Middle East. Russia takes a very hard stance on the Syrian conflict, standing by Bashar al-Assad from the beginning, and then of course intervening in the conflict militarily in 2015. So this is the first time that Russia is engaged in a military conflict far away from its own borders. It starts to work more actively with Turkey. It starts to work more with Iran. So there's a greater power projection by Russia. It goes into Libya with a covert presence to also project power vis-a-vis NATO and vis-a-vis the United States in the southern Mediterranean. So overall, I would say a greater pushback against Western policy through the 2010s. We're also, in terms of what's new, I think seeing more elements of rogue Russian behavior. The electoral meddling in the US elections in 2016, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the UK in 2018, disinformation campaigns in Africa backed up by the PMC Wagner group. So more sort of radical and rogue elements in Russian statecraft manifesting themselves after President Putin returns to the presidency in the early 2010s.
Were these policies and are these policies commensurate to the real strength and economic power of Russia? Because if you look at their GDP, it's roughly the same size of Spain. If you look at their demography, it's less than Bangladesh. And so to what extent Russia's foreign policies are stemming from their real power, real might?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I would characterize Russia's Middle East policy, the elements of which I just outlined with the presence in Syria, the covert presence in Libya, as a low-cost, high-return policy. Because Russia's presence in Syria, its military intervention in the conflict, wasn't all that costly for the Russian state. It didn't send ground troops to Syria. It was largely an air campaign. The ground troops were provided by Iran and by the Syrian government, and so the costs of that military campaign for Russia were largely commensurate with the continuous military exercise. And by working together with the Iranians and also then with Turkey in what came to be known as the Astana process and the progressive sidelining of Western countries in the Syrian conflict, Russia could actually achieve quite a lot on the ground with limited resources. Yes, it sent some military police into the conflict, but all this in terms of cost to the Russian state was absolutely manageable. Again, in Libya, it has not had an overt military presence. It has used various private military companies in order to pursue its economic interests in the conflict. So I think Russia's sort of Middle East policy, and there's of course also its relationship with the Gulf Arab states, with Iran, with Turkey, are an example where Russia actually managed to pursue its interests in a relatively cost-efficient manner. But of course, you could now make the argument that with invading in Ukraine in this conflict, with an incorrect reading of the situation on the ground and the kind of resistance that Russia would face in Ukraine, it really punched way above its weight. Putin blundered into Ukraine, and now Russian conventional military power is not proving commensurate to the task of fighting this war.
I'll come back to Ukraine, but before coming back to Ukraine, I want to talk about our region and specifically Russian-Turkish relations and Russian-Iranian relations, especially Russia-Turkey relations. If you look at they are regional rivals. They have certain political, military, and contradictions, especially when it comes to the Caucasus, to Libya, to Syria, and other places. But they are very good partners in other spheres like tourism, economy, trade. Russia is has built actually the first nuclear power plant in Turkey. How do these economic considerations, economic factors affect the general political rivalry between these two countries?
That's a great question. So let me put it this way. Up until the renewed full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February, Russia and Turkey had what I would call a relationship of adversarial collaboration. Yes, they pursued different interests in Syria, in Libya, in the South Caucasus, but they cooperated, deconflicted, talked to each other.
Someone called it co-opetition.
That's also an excellent term. And in the economic relationship, I would submit to you that it was important to both sides. Certainly for Russia, Turkey was more important than economic relations with the Gulf Arab states, for example. Tourism was important, the Akuyu nuclear power plant was important, but overall there was a feeling that Russia had more leverage in the relationship than Turkey. Now, I think very interestingly, there's a shift happening on the back of the invasion of Ukraine. Turkey is becoming increasingly important for Russia. Turkey is becoming an important conduit for the so-called roundabout trade, so trade into Russia, including of dual-use goods and sanctioned goods. Given the Western sanctions against Russia and the total disruption of economic ties, Turkey has become of elevated importance to the Russian economy, and what that means is that Russia has lesser cards to play vis-à-vis Turkey, including in some of those conflicts in which they cooperate, deconflict, but also compete. And you've seen this actually play out over the last year, where Russia is more risk-averse vis-à-vis Turkey in Syria. You could make the same argument about your region, about the South Caucasus. So there's interesting shifts in leverage happening. Of course, both sides still need each other, but there's a relative shift in leverage happening, I would argue, in favor of Turkey. And it's going to be very interesting to watch how that's going to play out over the medium term.
So, and we cannot talk about geopolitics and politics, regional politics in general, without touching the issue of Ukraine. So, was the war in Ukraine preventable? The general question, and what can be done now to curb the further escalation? Because as we watch, neither side is going to have a decisive victory here, and you're going to have more human losses, more casualties, more infrastructure damage, and so on.
Look, in terms of the inevitability of the conflict, I guess there's sort of two broad arguments here. There's one school that argues that this war was inevitable because Putin was always intent on some form of restoration of the Russian Empire. As evidence, people point to his own writings, Putin's own writings on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people to make the argument that he was never going to allow Ukraine to continue existing as a sovereign state. And then there's the contingency argument that says that there was interactions between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West, inflection points at which this could have been averted. First of all, I don't think that the ideological argument and Putin's ideological vision on Ukraine and certain Russian security grievances vis-à-vis NATO and NATO infrastructure in Ukraine, that these are mutually exclusive arguments. I think both can be present at the same time. What I will say to you on the inevitability question is, having sort of followed quite closely the diplomacy in the months leading up to this war, it is my feeling that Western states, the United States, made a real effort to prevent this war. Russia put security guarantee demands on the table, draft treaties in the winter before the war. There were some real offers by Western states on the table on things one could talk about, like a missile moratorium, military exercises, though the West said that certain things are not negotiable. There's not going to be a legal obligation to never admit Ukraine into NATO. That was off the table, but there was a real ditch effort. Russian commentators were writing 1 or 2 months before the war that what the West was offering was really serious and one should have those negotiations. Then the war came. So I think that my own reading is that the Kremlin, Putin, by that time had already decided that there was going to be war.
So, of course, critics would say that what would happen with Mexico if it decided to join the CST or make an alliance with Russia, but that's another question, another topic. Thank you, Hanna, and thank you for watching CivilNet.